It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful night. I had finished my shift at the office later than usual, and the roads were eerily empty as I drove home. The faint hum of my car engine was the only sound accompanying me on the desolate highway. The clock on the dashboard blinked 1:37 a.m. in a pale green glow. I remember thinking how much I hated night drives. The darkness seemed endless, swallowing everything beyond the reach of my headlights. But I had no choice. Work had been piling up, and I couldn't afford to slack off. Not in this economy, not when I had bills to pay. So, there I was, driving down that forsaken road, my eyes heavy, my mind wandering between the deadlines I had met and the ones still looming over me. It was a two-lane highway, surrounded by dense trees on both sides. Occasionally, I'd spot a flickering streetlight or the reflective eyes of some animal in the distance. The air was cold, seeping into the car despite the heater being on. I'd cracked the window slightly to keep myself alert, hoping the biting chill would keep me from dozing off. The first sign of trouble came when I noticed a car parked on the shoulder ahead. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, like they were on the verge of giving up. As I approached, I saw a man standing next to the car, waving his arms frantically. He was wearing a dark jacket, and his face was shadowed under a baseball cap. Instinctively, I slowed down. I wasn't the type to ignore someone in need, especially on a road like this, so isolated and far from any town. I pulled over a few feet ahead of him, rolling down my window just enough to talk. "Hey, you need help?" I called out. The man jogged up to my car. Up close, he looked rough, unshaven, and tired. His eyes darted around nervously. "Thank God you stopped," he said, slightly out of breath. "My car broke down. Battery's dead, I think. Can you give me a jump start?" I hesitated. Something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he avoided meeting my gaze or how his voice trembled. Not with fear, but with something I couldn't quite place. Still, I didn't want to leave him stranded. "Yeah, sure. Let me grab the cables," I said, stepping out of the car. The cold hit me like a slap. I shivered and opened my trunk, rummaging around for the jumper cables. The man stood uncomfortably close, watching me. His presence felt oppressive, like he was taking up more space than he physically occupied. My gut screamed at me to get back in my car and drive away, but I ignored it. As I turned to hand him the cables, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. Before I could react, something hard smashed into the back of my head. Pain exploded in my skull, and I crumpled to the ground. The world spun as I struggled to stay conscious, my vision blurring and darkening at the edges. I heard the man muttering something, his words incomprehensible, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was in my car, slumped against the steering wheel. My head throbbed, and a sticky warmth trickled down the side of my face. The first thing I noticed was that my keys were gone. Panic set in as I looked around. The man was nowhere to be seen, but his car was still there, hazard lights blinking weakly. My heart raced as I realized he must have taken my keys. I was stranded. I checked my pockets, relieved to find my phone still there. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. This road was notorious for its dead zones. I cursed under my breath, feeling trapped and helpless. That's when I saw the figure in my rearview mirror. The man was walking towards my car, something glinting in his hand. A knife. My blood ran cold. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the pain in my head. I scrambled to lock the doors, my fingers fumbling in my panic. Just as the locks clicked into place, he reached the driver's side window. He tapped the glass with the knife, a slow, deliberate motion that sent shivers down my spine. "Open the door," he said, his voice muffled but still audible through the glass. I shook my head, pressing myself against the seat. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. He smiled, a chilling, predatory smile. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be. Open the door, and I'll let you go." It was a lie. I could see it in his eyes, the way they gleamed with something dark and unhinged. I stayed silent, my mind racing. I had to think of a way out. Suddenly, he slammed the knife against the window, the blade scratching the glass but not breaking it. The sound made me flinch. He growled in frustration and moved to the back of the car, disappearing from view. My heart pounded as I tried to guess his next move. Was he going to slash my tires? Break a window? Set the car on fire? I didn't wait to find out. I climbed into the passenger seat and opened the door, slipping out as quietly as I could. Keeping low, I crept towards the trees, hoping the darkness would conceal me. The cold air bit into my skin, but I barely felt it over the adrenaline coursing through me. From the shadows, I watched as he circled the car, cursing under his breath. He kicked the tires and banged on the windows, growing more agitated by the second. Finally, he stopped and looked around, his head snapping in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. Had he seen me? He took a step towards the trees, then another. I pressed myself against a tree trunk, trying to make myself as small as possible. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe. Then his phone rang. The sudden sound made both of us jump. He pulled it out of his pocket and answered it, his voice low and hurried. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it seemed urgent. After a few moments, he hung up and started walking back to his car. Relief washed over me as I realized he was leaving, but my relief was short-lived. Instead of driving away, he opened the trunk and pulled out a gas canister. My stomach dropped as I realized his plan. He was going to set my car on fire, with me still inside if he thought I was hiding there. I couldn't let that happen. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I picked up a large branch from the ground and crept closer to him. He was pouring gasoline over the hood of my car, completely focused on his task. I gripped the branch tightly, my palms sweaty, and swung it with all my strength. The branch connected with the back of his head, and he stumbled forward, dropping the gas canister. He turned to face me, his expression a mix of shock and rage. "You little," he started, but I didn't let him finish. I swung again, this time aiming for his arm. He cried out in pain, the knife falling from his grasp. I didn't stick around to see what he would do next. I ran. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I could hear him shouting behind me, his footsteps pounding against the ground. He was chasing me. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted deeper into the forest. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between us. But the forest was disorienting, and soon I realized I had no idea where I was. I stumbled to a halt, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. Had I lost him? I didn't have time to find out. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the trees. A car was approaching on the highway. Summoning the last of my strength, I ran towards the light, waving my arms and shouting for help. The car screeched to a halt, and a middle-aged couple stepped out, their faces etched with concern. "What happened?" the man asked, his voice steady but urgent. "There's a man," I panted. "Back there. He tried to kill me. Call the police, please." The woman pulled out her phone and dialed while the man helped me into their car. As we waited for the police, I told them everything, from the moment I stopped to help the man to the chase through the forest. When the police arrived, they searched the area and found him near my car, unconscious and bleeding from where I had hit him. He was arrested on the spot. Later, I learned he was a wanted criminal, linked to several other attacks on the same highway. He had been using the broken-down car routine to lure victims. That night changed me. I still hate night drives. But now it's not just because of the darkness. It's because I know what kind of monsters can hide in the shadows, the humankind, and I'll never ignore my gut feeling again. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful night. My office shift had stretched much later than usual, leaving me to navigate an empty stretch of highway in the dead of night. The hum of my car engine was the only sound, a monotone companion to my growing unease. The dashboard clock glowed 1:37 a.m. in faint green, each blink a reminder of the hour's wait. I've always hated night drives. Something about the darkness, vast and unyielding, felt oppressive, like a living thing. Work had been relentless lately, and in today's economy, there was no room for slacking. So here I was, clutching the wheel with tired fingers, my mind flipping between the completed deadlines and the ones still waiting to suffocate me. The road stretched on, a two-lane strip cutting through an endless forest. Occasionally, a flickering streetlight would appear, or the reflective eyes of some animal would glint in the distance. Even with the heater on, the cold crept in, gnawing at my fingers. I cracked the window open slightly, hoping the chill would help stave off my fatigue. Ahead, the dim glow of hazard lights flickered weakly on the shoulder. A parked car came into view, a lone figure standing beside it, waving their arms. The man wore a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. As I slowed down, the thought crossed my mind that I could just keep driving, pretend I hadn't seen him. But the road was too empty, too isolated. It felt wrong to leave him stranded. Against my better judgment, I pulled over a few feet ahead and rolled my window down just enough to speak. "Need some help?" I asked, keeping my tone casual but wary. He jogged up to the car, his face shadowed but his breath visible in the cold. "Thank God you stopped," he said, a note of desperation in his voice. "My battery's dead. Can you give me a jump start?" Something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around, never quite meeting mine, or how his voice seemed to tremble. Not with fear, but something harder to pin down. I hesitated, but then guilt nudged me forward. "Yeah, sure," I replied. "Let me grab the cables." The cold bit into me as I stepped out, shivering against the wind. I popped the trunk and began rummaging for the jumper cables, acutely aware of the man standing too close for comfort. His presence felt heavy, almost suffocating, and my gut screamed at me to get back in the car and leave. But I ignored it, chalking up my unease to exhaustion and the eerie setting. As I turned to hand him the cables, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Before I could react, something hard struck the back of my head. Pain exploded like a firework, and I crumpled to the ground. The world spun, fading in and out as I struggled to stay conscious. Distantly, I heard the man muttering, his voice a garbled mess of words. Then, darkness consumed me. When I woke, I was slumped over the steering wheel. My head throbbed with searing pain, and I felt something warm trickling down my temple. Groggily, I realized my keys were gone. Panic shot through me as I glanced around. The man was nowhere to be seen, but his car still sat on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. My hands trembled as I checked my pockets, relieved to find my phone still there. I tried calling for help, but of course there was no signal. This stretch of highway was infamous for its dead zones. That's when I saw him in the rearview mirror. He was walking toward my car, a knife glinting in his hand. My breath hitched, and adrenaline kicked in, overriding the pain in my head. I scrambled to lock the doors, my fingers fumbling in my panic. Just as the locks clicked into place, he reached the driver's side window. He tapped the glass with the knife, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down my spine. "Open the door," he said, his voice muffled but calm. Too calm. I shook my head, my heart hammering in my chest. "Leave me alone," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. His lips curled into a predatory smile. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Open the door, and I'll let you go." It was a lie. I could see it in his eyes, gleaming with something dark and unhinged. My mind raced, desperate for a way out. Suddenly, he slammed the knife against the window, the blade scraping but not breaking the glass. The sound made me flinch, and he growled in frustration. He moved to the back of the car, disappearing from view. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. Crawling into the passenger seat, I opened the door and slipped out as quietly as I could. Keeping low, I crept toward the trees, the darkness my only cover. The cold air bit into my skin, but fear numbed me to everything except survival. From the shadows, I watched as he circled my car, cursing under his breath. He kicked the tires and banged on the windows, growing more agitated. Then he stopped, his head snapping in my direction. My stomach dropped. Had he seen me? He took a step toward the trees, then another. I pressed myself against a trunk, barely daring to breathe. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. But then his phone rang, the sudden sound breaking the tense silence. He answered it, speaking in hurried, hushed tones. After a moment, he hung up and turned back toward his car. Relief washed over me until I saw him pull a gas canister from his trunk. My blood ran cold. He was going to set my car on fire, probably thinking I was still inside. I couldn't let that happen. Gripping a large branch I found on the ground, I crept closer, my hands shaking. He was pouring gasoline over the hood, completely focused. Summoning every ounce of courage, I swung the branch as hard as I could. It connected with the back of his head, and he stumbled forward, dropping the gas canister. He turned, his face twisted in rage and surprise. "You," he started, but I didn't let him finish. I swung again, this time hitting his arm. The knife fell from his hand, and he howled in pain. I ran. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I didn't stop. Behind me, his furious shouts grew fainter, but I didn't dare slow down. The trees blurred around me, disorienting and endless. Finally, headlights appeared through the darkness. A car was approaching on the highway. I stumbled toward the light, waving my arms and shouting for help. The car screeched to a halt, and a middle-aged couple stepped out, their faces etched with concern. "What happened?" the man asked, his voice steady but urgent. "There's a man," I gasped. "He tried to kill me. Call the police." The woman pulled out her phone, dialing as the man helped me into their car. Between ragged breaths, I recounted everything. The broken-down car, the attack, the chase. They listened intently, their faces pale under the car's interior light. When the police arrived, they found him near my car, unconscious and bleeding. He was arrested on the spot. Later, I learned he was a wanted criminal, linked to several similar attacks on isolated highways. His modus operandi was always the same: feigning car trouble to lure in unsuspecting Good Samaritans. That night changed me forever. I still hate night drives, but now it's not just the darkness that unnerves me. It's knowing what kind of monsters can hide in plain sight. From that day on, I vowed to trust my instincts, no matter how irrational they seemed. It's better to be cautious than to become a cautionary tale. The highway stretched endlessly before me, its asphalt shimmering faintly under the dim glow of the moon. I had always loved the serenity of long drives, the way the road seemed to promise a kind of freedom that was hard to find elsewhere. But tonight was different. Tonight, the road felt more like a trap. It had been a last-minute decision to drive back home after visiting an old friend in a neighboring city. The visit had run late, filled with nostalgic conversations and laughter, and by the time I left, it was well past midnight. The thought of spending money on a motel for just a few hours of sleep seemed unnecessary, so I opted to take the highway and make the 3-hour drive home. The first hour passed uneventfully. My car hummed steadily, and the soothing rhythm of tires against the road lulled me into a false sense of security. The radio played softly in the background, a mix of old rock and pop hits that kept me company. Occasionally, another car would pass by, its headlights cutting through the darkness, but for the most part, I was alone. Alone except for the growing sense of unease. It started as a small prickling at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the back seat was empty. The highway behind me was dark, the headlights of distant cars barely visible. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling. It was just the quiet of the night playing tricks on me. The clock on the dashboard read 1:22 a.m. when I saw it. A car parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly. As I drew closer, I could make out a figure standing beside it, waving their arms. A part of me hesitated. It wasn't uncommon to see stranded motorists, but at this hour, in the middle of nowhere. Something about it felt off. Still, I couldn't just drive past without at least checking if they needed help. I slowed down and pulled over a few feet ahead of the car. My heart was beating faster now, though I couldn't say why. Rolling down the passenger side window, I called out, "You okay? Need some help?" The figure jogged toward me. It was a man, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. His face was partially shadowed, but I could see enough to notice his strained expression. "Thank God you stopped," he said, his voice breathless. "My car won't start. I think the battery's dead. Can you give me a jump?" I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. There was something about his tone, the way his eyes darted around nervously, that made me uneasy. But what could I do? Drive off and leave him stranded? I sighed and nodded. "Sure. Let me grab the cables." Stepping out of the car, I felt the chill of the night air seep through my jacket. The man stood a little too close as I opened the trunk and retrieved the jumper cables. His presence was oppressive, his movements jittery. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the car and leave, but I pushed the thought aside. I wasn't going to let paranoia turn me into a bad person. As I turned to hand him the cables, a sharp pain exploded at the back of my head. The world tilted, my vision blurring as I collapsed onto the ground. For a moment, everything was muffled. His voice, distant and distorted, muttering something I couldn't understand. Then, darkness. When I came to, I was slumped over the steering wheel. My head throbbed painfully, and my vision swam as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The hazard lights from the man's car were still blinking, casting eerie flashes of orange across the empty road. My keys were gone, and when I reached for my phone, relief washed over me to find it still in my pocket. But there was no signal. Panic surged through me as I looked around. The man was nowhere to be seen, but the unease in the pit of my stomach grew heavier. I tried to start the car, only to remember the keys were missing. That's when I saw him in the rearview mirror, walking toward my car. A glint of metal in his hand caught the light. A knife. Adrenaline flooded my system. I fumbled to lock the doors, my fingers trembling as I hit the button just as he reached the driver's side window. He tapped the glass with the knife, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down my spine. "Open the door," he said, his voice calm but menacing. My breath hitched. "Go away," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Open the door, and I won't hurt you." I didn't believe him. The look in his eyes was enough to tell me he had no intention of letting me go. My mind raced, desperate for a plan. He slammed the knife against the window, but the glass held. Frustrated, he moved toward the back of the car, disappearing from view. Taking a deep breath, I unbuckled my seatbelt and crawled into the passenger seat. Opening the door as quietly as I could, I slipped out and crouched low, using the car as cover. The cold night air bit at my skin, but I didn't dare move too quickly. My only chance was to reach the tree line a few yards away. I darted toward the trees, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Once I was hidden among the shadows, I turned to look back. He was circling the car, his frustration evident in the way he kicked the tires and banged on the windows. Then he stopped, his head snapping up as if he'd sensed where I was. He started toward the trees, and I pressed myself against a trunk, barely daring to breathe. My hands clenched around a fallen branch, my only weapon. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, crunching against the dry leaves. Just when I thought he'd find me, his phone rang. The sudden noise startled both of us. He answered it, his voice low and hurried. After a brief exchange, he hung up and turned back toward the car. Relief washed over me as I watched him retrieve a gas canister from the trunk. My relief turned to horror when I realized what he was planning. He was going to set my car on fire. I couldn't let that happen. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept closer, the branch held tightly in my hands. As he poured gasoline over the hood, I swung the branch with all my strength, hitting the back of his head. He stumbled forward, dropping the canister. Before he could recover, I struck again, this time knocking the knife from his hand. I ran, my legs burning as I pushed through the trees. His shouts echoed behind me, but I didn't dare look back. The highway came into view, and with it, the headlights of an approaching car. I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms frantically. The car screeched to a halt, and a man and woman stepped out, their faces filled with concern. "What happened?" the man asked, his voice steady but urgent. "There's a man," I gasped. "He tried to kill me. Call the police." The woman dialed as the man helped me into their car. I told them everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. When the police arrived, they found him unconscious near my car. He was arrested, and later I learned he was wanted for multiple crimes. That night left a scar, not just on my body but on my mind. The highway no longer felt like a place of freedom. It was a reminder of how quickly the mundane could turn into a nightmare. I still drive at night sometimes, but I've learned to trust my instincts. It's better to be paranoid than to become a victim.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, it takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.